Have you ever felt embarrassed? Not because of who you are, but because of someone who loved you more than anyone else ever did? Because one man made that mistake. He didn't shout. He didn't betray anyone loudly. He just stayed silent. And by the time he realized what that silence had cost him, it was already too late to take it back. I still remember the moment he told me the story. Not because of what he said, but because of how long he paused before saying it. It was one of those pauses that makes you realize the story isn't really about the past. It's about something that never quite left. He said, "I didn't think it was a big decision at the time. And honestly, I believed him, because that's how most irreversible decisions begin. Quietly, almost invisibly." His name was Min. At that point in his life, everything looked like it was finally falling into place. He had a stable job, the kind people respect without asking too many questions. He had just gotten engaged to someone he genuinely loved. Not the dramatic kind of love. No chaos, no games. Just calm, steady, reliable. Her name was Lan, and if you looked at them from the outside, you'd probably say they were lucky. The kind of couple people assume will have a smooth life, a predictable happiness. But here's something I've noticed. The more perfect a situation looks, the more pressure there is behind it to keep it that way. It started with something small. They didn't even want a big wedding. Min told me they had originally planned something simple. Sign the papers, maybe travel somewhere quiet, spend a few days just being together without expectations. But that plan didn't last long. Because in reality, weddings are rarely just about two people. They're about families, appearances, expectations that have been building long before the couple even met. Both sides of the family wanted something bigger. Just one proper celebration, they said. Something memorable. And you know what's interesting? When people say memorable, they don't always mean meaningful. Sometimes they mean impressive. Sometimes they mean expensive. Min didn't resist. And that's where everything slowly began to shift. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would notice at first. Just small compromises. A larger venue. A longer guest list. A better-looking menu. Each decision made sense on its own, but together, they started turning something personal into something performative. I remember asking him, "Did you feel uncomfortable at that point?" He shook his head. "No, not yet." And I think that's the part that stayed with me the most. Because discomfort doesn't always arrive at the beginning of a mistake. Sometimes it waits until you're already too far in to turn back easily. The conversations at home started changing. His mother became more involved. Not in a controlling way, at least not obviously. More like invested. She talked about details, about guests, about how everything needed to be appropriate. That word came up more often than anything else. Appropriate. At first, it sounded harmless, but the more it was repeated, the more it started to feel like a filter. Like everything and everyone had to pass through it. Min told me there was one morning in particular he couldn't forget. It didn't feel special at the time. Just breakfast. Just another conversation. But looking back, he said, that was the moment everything changed. I asked him what happened. He hesitated again. Then he said something that, for some reason, hit harder than anything else in the story. "It wasn't an argument," he said. "No one raised their voice." He looked down for a second before continuing. "That's why I didn't realize how serious it was." And then he told me the sentence. Just one sentence. Simple, calm, almost logical. But it drew a line he didn't even notice crossing. He said, "My mother looked at me and said, 'Maybe it's better if your grandmother doesn't come to the wedding.'" And for a moment, he said nothing. Not because he agreed. Not because he disagreed. But because, in that exact second, he chose not to decide. And that silence, that was the decision. I asked him what he felt in that moment. Right after his mother said it, that sentence, that quiet, carefully worded suggestion that didn't sound like an order, but somehow felt heavier than one. He took a breath before answering. "Nothing," he said at first. And then he corrected himself. "Or at least, nothing clear." That answer stayed with me. Because I think we expect big emotions when something important happens. Anger, shock, resistance. But real life doesn't always work like that. Sometimes the most important moments arrive without noise, and if you're not paying attention, they pass through you, unnoticed. He told me the room felt normal. The same table, the same morning light, the same routine. His father didn't say anything at first, just paused for a second, like he wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. Then came a quiet question. Why? Not confrontational? Not even emotional. Just confused. And for a moment, there was a chance for everything to go differently. I really believe that. Because sometimes all it takes is one person asking the right question at the right time to interrupt a bad decision. But his mother already had an answer. She won't feel comfortable, she said. It's going to be a formal event. A lot of important guests. Her tone was calm, reasonable. That's what made it dangerous. Because nothing she said sounded cruel on the surface. It sounded practical, and practicality has a way of disguising things we don't want to confront. Min told me he remembers looking down at his cup of coffee, not at his mother, not at his father, just at the surface of something that didn't require a response. I think that's when I started avoiding it, he admitted. Avoiding eye contact, avoiding responsibility, avoiding the need to take a position. I didn't interrupt him, but I was thinking the same thing. Avoidance doesn't feel like a choice when you're doing it. It feels like relief, like you're buying yourself time. But what you're really doing is letting someone else decide who you're going to be in that moment. His father tried again. She raised him, he said quietly, not arguing, just reminding. And that sentence, simple as it was, carried more truth than anything else said in that room. But truth doesn't always win, not when something else is louder inside you. His mother sighed, not in frustration, more like disappointment. I'm not saying she's not important, she said, but this is different. Different. Another harmless word. Another filter. Another way to separate people without saying it directly. Min told me that was the moment something shifted inside him. Not completely, not decisively, just enough. Enough to make him start thinking in comparisons. He started imagining the wedding, the venue, the guests, the conversations, and then he imagined his grandmother in that space, her clothes, her quiet presence, the way she never tried to stand out. And for the first time in his life, he didn't see her the way he used to. Not as the person who raised him, not as the one who shaped everything he had become, but as someone who didn't fit. He stopped talking for a moment after saying that, and when he continued, his voice was lower. I hate that part, he said. I hate that I even thought that. I didn't say anything, because what could you say? That he was wrong? He already knew that. But knowing something is wrong and stopping yourself from doing it are two very different things. He told me he tried to justify it. She'll understand, he said to himself. She doesn't like big events anyway. It might even be better for her. That's how it works, isn't it? We rewrite the truth in a way that makes it easier to live with, not because we believe it completely, but because we need something that sounds reasonable enough to quiet the discomfort. And slowly, that discomfort started to fade. Not because the situation changed, but because he adjusted to it. That's the part I find the most unsettling. Not the decision itself, but how quickly a person can get used to something that once felt wrong. I asked him when he finally realized he had made a choice. He didn't answer right away. Then he said something I don't think I'll forget. It wasn't when I agreed, he said. It was when I stopped trying to disagree. And that's when I understood. The silence in that room wasn't empty. It was shaping him, quietly, irreversibly. And the worst part? He still believed everything was under control. If you had met Min a few weeks before that morning, you wouldn't have recognized the version of him he was slowly becoming. That's the strange thing about change. It rarely feels like a transformation. It feels like adjustment, small shifts in perspective, tiny compromises in the way you think, until one day you look back and realize you're no longer seeing the same world. Min didn't wake up the next day and suddenly decide his grandmother didn't belong at his wedding. It didn't happen like that. It happened gradually, quietly, almost logically. He told me that after that conversation, he started noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Not big things, details. The kind you usually ignore because they don't matter. Or at least, they didn't used to. He went with Lan to visit her family one evening. It was nothing unusual, just dinner. But that night stayed in his mind, not because of anything anyone said, but because of how everything felt. The house was large, but not in an obvious way. It wasn't trying to impress. It just did. Everything was in place. The lighting, the furniture, the way people moved and spoke. There was a kind of quiet confidence in that space. No one needed to prove anything, and somehow that made everything feel even more elevated. Lan's parents were kind. That's important. They didn't look down on him. They didn't ask uncomfortable questions. They didn't make him feel unwelcome. In fact, they treated him with respect, genuine respect. But here's what Min told me, and I think this is where everything started to change inside him. It wasn't what they did, he said. It was what I started doing in my own head. He began comparing, not consciously at first, just small thoughts, passing observations. He noticed the conversations, how easily they talked about travel, about business, about things he had never experienced himself. He noticed how natural it all seemed to them. No hesitation, no explanation needed. And then, without meaning to, he started measuring where he came from, what he had, what he could offer. I asked him if anyone had ever made him feel inferior. He shook his head immediately. No, he said, that's the worst part. Because when someone makes you feel small, you can resist it. You can reject it. You can push back. But when no one does anything wrong, and you still feel smaller? That feeling comes from somewhere else. From inside. And that's much harder to fight. He told me that on the way home that night, he couldn't stop thinking. Not about the dinner itself, but about the gap, the invisible distance between two worlds. One he was entering, and one he came from. I started asking myself questions I had never asked before, he admitted. Questions like, would I be enough for this life? Would I always feel like I was catching up? Would people see the difference? Even if they didn't say it? And then, almost inevitably, his thoughts circled back to his family, to his home, to the people who had shaped him. And that's where it became uncomfortable. Because comparison doesn't stop at you. It spreads. It reaches into everything connected to you. He thought about his parents, their efforts, their limitations, the way they had always tried to present themselves in a certain way. And then he thought about his grandmother. And this time, he didn't just remember her warmth. He didn't just remember the quiet afternoons, the lessons, the sense of safety. He saw something else, her worn-out coat, her small apartment, the simplicity of her life, things he had seen 1,000 times before, but never judged. Until now, he stopped talking again at this point. Longer this time. And when he finally spoke, there was something heavier in his voice. I think that's when it happened, he said. Not when my mother suggested it, not when I stayed silent, but when I started agreeing without saying it out loud. That's the part that changes people, not the external pressure, but the moment your internal voice begins to echo it. He didn't say, she shouldn't come. He didn't need to, because somewhere inside him, the idea had already settled. And once an idea feels reasonable, it becomes very hard to challenge, even if it's wrong. Especially if it's wrong. I asked him one last question before we moved on. Did you notice what you were losing at that moment? He didn't hesitate this time. No, he said. I thought I was protecting something. He paused, then added almost quietly, I didn't realize I was replacing it. There's always someone in our lives we never think twice about, not because they're unimportant, but because they feel permanent, like they'll always be there, exactly the same, no matter how much everything else changes. For Min, that person was his grandmother. And maybe that's why it was so easy to overlook what she really meant. Because when something feels constant, we stop paying attention to its value. We assume it doesn't need to be protected. He didn't talk about her right away. Not when he was describing the wedding. Not when he was explaining the pressure. Not even when he admitted he had started to agree with the idea of not inviting her. It was only after a long pause that he finally said, "She was the only place I never felt like I had to prove anything." That sentence told me everything. Because people like that don't show up often. And when they do, we rarely realize how rare they are until we start drifting away from them. His grandmother lived in a small apartment. Nothing impressive, nothing that would stand out. If anything, it was the kind of place people pass by without noticing. But for Min, growing up, it had been something else entirely. A quiet space, a place where time moved slower, where expectations didn't follow him through the door. He told me about afternoons spent there as a child. No expensive toys, no distractions, just simple routines. Tea on the table, books stacked neatly, soft conversations that didn't feel like lessons, but somehow taught him everything he needed to know. She had taught him how to read, long before school made it a requirement. She had taught him patience without ever using the word. And most importantly, she had taught him a language that later became the foundation of his entire career. "I wouldn't have my job without her," he said, not as a dramatic statement, just as a fact. And yet, somewhere along the way, that fact had become distant. Not untrue, just less present in his mind. I think that's what happens when life moves forward. We don't forget what people did for us. We just stop feeling it as strongly as we once did. And when that feeling fades, it becomes easier to make decisions that would have been unthinkable before. He told me his grandmother never complained. Not about her life, not about her situation. She lived simply, but not bitterly. And that distinction matters because there's a difference between lacking something and resenting it. She never made anyone feel guilty for what she didn't have. Never asked for more. Never demanded recognition. She made everything feel enough, Min said. And I think that's what made the contrast so sharp. Because the world he was stepping into, the one filled with expectations, appearances, and quiet comparisons, was built on the idea that enough was never quite enough. There was always something more to reach for, something better to present, something higher to match. And in that kind of environment, simplicity doesn't feel peaceful. It feels out of place. He admitted something to me then that I don't think he had said out loud before. "I started seeing her through other people's eyes," he said. Not because anyone told him to, not because anyone forced him, but because once that seed of comparison was planted, it began to grow on its own. He imagined the wedding again. The guests, the atmosphere, the unspoken standards. And then he placed her in that picture. And suddenly, she didn't look like the center of his childhood anymore. She looked like someone who didn't belong in that frame. That's the danger of perspective. Not that it changes what's real, but that it changes what feels acceptable. I asked him if he realized what he was doing at that moment. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I thought I was just being realistic." Realistic, another word that sounds harmless. Another word that quietly justifies decisions we don't want to question too deeply. But realism, without reflection, can become something else entirely. It can turn gratitude into distance. It can turn love into something conditional. And in Min's case, it turned the most important person in his life into someone he started to consider leaving out. Not because she mattered less, but because, in that moment, he had started to believe that fitting in mattered more. Some moments don't feel important when they happen. No raised voices, no dramatic silence. No clear sense that something irreversible is about to begin. Just a normal morning. That's what Min kept repeating. It was just breakfast. But I've learned something about moments like that. The quieter they are, the easier it is to underestimate them, and the harder it is to undo what follows. He said the conversation didn't even start about his grandmother. It started with details, the venue, the guest list, the seating arrangement, all the things that make a wedding look organized on the outside, while slowly complicating everything underneath. His mother had a notebook open, pages filled with names, notes, little markings only she understood. She was focused, careful, precise. And then, almost casually, she paused, looked up, and said it. Maybe we shouldn't invite your grandmother? Not we can't. Not we won't. Just maybe we shouldn't. That word, maybe, did a lot of work. It softened the statement, made it feel like a suggestion, like something open for discussion. But Min told me something interesting. It didn't feel optional. That's how influence works sometimes. It doesn't force you. It just frames the decision in a way that makes resistance feel unnecessary or even unreasonable. His father looked up immediately. This time, there was no delay. What do you mean? He asked. There was tension in his voice now, not loud, but present. And again, this could have gone differently. It could have turned into a real conversation, a disagreement, a moment where lines were drawn clearly. But his mother stayed calm. She won't feel comfortable, she said. And honestly, it might not look right. That last part hung in the air. Not look right. She didn't explain it further. She didn't need to, because everyone at that table understood what it implied. Min told me he felt something in his chest at that moment. Not anger, not even sadness. More like pressure. A quiet, tightening feeling, like something was being asked of him without being directly demanded. His father tried again. She's family, he said. Simple, direct, undeniable. And for a second, Min said he almost spoke. Almost. He thought about everything. The afternoons at her apartment, the lessons, the way she had always been there without asking for anything in return. All of it came back, clear and immediate. But then something else came in just as quickly. The image of the wedding, the expectations, the invisible standards he had been measuring himself against for weeks. And suddenly, those two things didn't feel like they belonged in the same space. That's when hesitation becomes dangerous, because hesitation isn't neutral. It leans slowly, quietly, toward the easier choice. His mother closed the notebook gently. I'm just thinking about what's best, she said. No accusation, no harshness, just concern. And that made it even harder to challenge. Because how do you argue with something that sounds like care? Min looked at his father, then at his mother. And then he did the one thing that would decide everything. He said nothing. Not no. Not yes. Just nothing. And in that silence, the conversation moved forward, as if the decision had already been made. His father didn't push further. Maybe he thought Min would speak later. Maybe he didn't want to create conflict. Or maybe he saw what Min himself didn't want to admit yet. That the absence of resistance was already an answer. Min told me that after that moment, everything felt strangely normal again. They continued talking about the wedding, about food, about guests, about details that suddenly felt more important than they should have. That's what scared me later, he said. How quickly we moved on. Because when something truly matters, you expect it to leave a mark. A pause, a shift in the room. But this didn't. It just blended into everything else, like it belonged there, like it was reasonable, like it was already decided. I asked him if he realized, even then, what had just happened. He shook his head. No, he said. I thought I still had time to fix it. He paused, then added more quietly. I didn't understand that I had already chosen. And that's the thing about certain decisions. They don't happen when you say them out loud. They happen the moment you stop being willing to say the opposite. The strange thing about doing something wrong is that it rarely feels wrong for very long, at least not in a way that forces you to stop. What usually happens instead is that you start explaining it to yourself. And if you're careful enough with those explanations, you can make almost anything feel acceptable. Min told me the days after that conversation felt normal. Too normal. He went to work. He answered emails. He talked about the wedding with Lan like nothing had shifted. And on the surface, nothing had. There were no arguments, no confrontations, no dramatic turning point. Just a quiet understanding that something had been decided. Even if no one had said it directly, I asked him if he thought about his grandmother during those days. He nodded. Yeah, he said, but not the way I should have. That answer needed explaining, and he knew it. I didn't think about how she would feel, he continued. I thought about how to make it make sense. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when you focus on meaning instead of impact, you stop asking whether something is right. You start asking whether it can be justified. And Min had already begun that process. He told himself things that sounded reasonable. She doesn't like crowded places anyway. She might get tired. It's better for her to stay comfortable at home. Each sentence felt harmless, even thoughtful. But none of them were really about her. They were about him. About reducing the discomfort he didn't want to face. That's how justification works. It borrows the language of care to hide the absence of it. I didn't say that to him. He already knew. You could hear it in the way he spoke. There was no defensiveness, just recognition. He told me something else that stayed with me. I stopped imagining her reaction. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, so I asked. He explained that earlier, before all of this, if he had ever thought about not inviting her, he would have immediately pictured her face, her smile, her quiet way of listening, the way she never made anything about herself. And that image alone would have made the idea impossible. But now, he avoided it, not consciously, but consistently, because imagining her reaction would have made everything real, and reality would have forced him to choose differently. So instead, he kept everything abstract. A situation, a decision, a practical adjustment, not a person. Not a relationship, not someone who had been there his entire life. That's another thing I've learned. Distance doesn't always come from physical space. Sometimes it comes from the way we think about people. The moment you stop seeing someone as a person with feelings and start seeing them as part of a situation, you've already stepped away from them. Even if you're still standing right where you've always been. Min said there were moments when doubt tried to come back. Small ones, unexpected. Like when he passed a bookstore and remembered how she used to sit with him, helping him sound out words patiently. Or when he heard someone speaking English fluently and thought, that started with her. Those moments didn't last long, because every time they appeared, he pushed them aside. Not aggressively, just gently. Like moving something out of the way so you can keep walking. I didn't want to feel conflicted, he admitted. I just wanted it to be simple. And that's the trap. Because the simplest version of a situation is rarely the most honest one. It's just the easiest to live with in the moment. I asked him if anyone else brought it up again. He shook his head. No, he said. And I think that made it worse. Because when no one challenges you, you start believing there's nothing left to question. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't just in that breakfast conversation. It had spread into his thoughts, into his decisions, into the way he moved through his own life. And the more familiar that silence became, the less he noticed it. That's what made it dangerous. Not loud enough to resist, not uncomfortable enough to stop, just quiet enough to continue. I asked him when he finally realized something was wrong. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said something I think explains everything about that period of his life. It wasn't when I made the decision, he said. It was when I stopped feeling anything about it. He paused, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. That's when I should have been worried, because indifference isn't the absence of emotion. It's the result of choosing not to feel for too long. There are conversations you prepare for. You think about the words. You rehearse the tone. You try to control how they'll unfold. And then there are conversations you can't prepare for at all. Not because you don't know what to say, but because you know exactly what it will mean once you say it. Min stood in front of her door longer than he expected. He told me it wasn't hesitation. At least, that's what he tried to believe. It was just timing, he said, like he was waiting for the right moment to knock. But moments don't fix things. They don't make difficult truths easier. They just delay them. He was holding a small box of pastries, something simple, familiar, the kind of thing he had brought 100 times before without thinking. But this time, it felt different. Not like a gift. More like a distraction. Something to fill the space before the real reason he was there revealed itself. He knocked. And almost immediately, the door opened. She smiled, the same way she always did. No hesitation. No questions. just genuine warmth. That kind of smile is hard to face when you're about to hurt the person giving it. She was happy to see me, Min said. And there was something in his voice when he said that, something heavier than guilt. Because happiness, in that moment, felt undeserved. He stepped inside. Everything was the same. The familiar scent of tea, the quiet arrangement of things that never seemed to change. It should have felt comforting, but instead, it made what he came to do feel even more out of place. She moved around the kitchen, preparing tea without asking. She didn't need to. Some habits don't require words. He sat down, and for a few minutes, they talked about nothing important. Work, the weather. Small things that usually made conversation easy. But this time, every word felt like it was avoiding something. He told me he kept waiting for the right moment, that point in the conversation where it would feel natural to say it. But it never came, because some things don't belong in any moment. They interrupt it, they change it, they divide everything into before and after. Finally, she looked at him, not sharply, not suspiciously, just attentively. You didn't come this late just to bring me pastries, she said gently. It wasn't a question. It was an understanding. And in that moment, he realized something she already knew. Not the details, not the exact words, but the weight of why he was there. I couldn't say it, he admitted. I had rehearsed it so many times. But when I saw her, everything disappeared. Of course it did. Because rehearsing something in your head is very different from saying it to someone who matters. He tried anyway. Started with something vague. The wedding. It's becoming complicated. She nodded. Encouraging. Patient. Always making it easier for him to continue. That's what made it harder. He went on, talking about the venue, the number of guests, the limitations, each sentence circling around the truth without touching it. And then she helped him, not by asking directly, but by finishing the thought he couldn't bring himself to complete. There isn't enough space for everyone you'd like to invite, she said softly. He froze for a second, because that wasn't exactly what he meant, but it was close enough to give him an escape, and he took it. He nodded, too quickly. Yeah, something like that. That was it. That was the moment. Not when he said it clearly, but when he allowed her to say it for him and chose not to correct it. He told me that was the worst part. Not the words, but the relief. Because as soon as it was said, even indirectly, the tension he had been carrying for days disappeared. Like a weight lifted, like something had finally been resolved. And she didn't react the way he feared. No disappointment, no visible hurt. She smiled. The same calm, gentle smile. That makes sense, she said. Weddings are complicated. And just like that, she made it easy. Too easy. I asked him what he felt in that moment. He didn't hesitate this time. Relieved, he said. And then, after a pause, that's what scares me now. Because relief shouldn't come from doing something that goes against everything you believe in. But at that time, it did. And he didn't question it. Not yet. He just sat there, drinking tea with the person he had just quietly left out of one of the most important days of his life, while she made sure he didn't feel bad about it. And that was the conversation he never really had. There's a kind of reaction we expect when we hurt someone. Disappointment, silence, maybe even anger. Something that reflects back what we've done. Something that forces us to face it. But what Min received instead was kindness. And somehow, that made everything harder to understand. He told me that after that conversation, nothing changed on the surface. They finished their tea. They talked a little more. He stayed longer than he planned to. Not because he wanted to fix anything, but because leaving felt uncomfortable. Like walking away would make it final. And maybe, somewhere deep down, he still hoped it wasn't. His grandmother didn't bring it up again. Not directly. She didn't ask questions, didn't try to clarify, didn't even hesitate in the way she spoke to him afterward. Everything felt normal, and that's what made it so unsettling. Because when something painful is handled too gently, it doesn't disappear. It just goes deeper. He said there was a moment when she got up to refill his tea. Just a small, ordinary movement. But he noticed something. Her hands, they were steady. Not trembling, not hesitant, just calm. And that detail stayed with him because it told him something he wasn't ready to admit yet. She had already accepted it, not the excuse he gave, but the reality behind it. I think she understood more than I said, Min told me. Of course she did. People who love you long enough learn to read what you don't say, and sometimes they choose not to confront it, not because they don't see it, but because they don't want to make it harder for you. That's what she was doing, making it easier. Again, just like she always had. He told me that before he left, she said something that didn't seem important at the time. Just a simple sentence. "You've grown up," she said with a soft smile. "I'm proud of you." That should have felt good, reassuring, but it didn't, not completely, because there was something about the way she said it, something quiet beneath the words that he couldn't explain. Not then. But later, it came back to him, over and over again. I asked him if he thought she was hurt. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that I think captures the entire moment perfectly. "She didn't let me see it." And that's the problem with people like her. They protect you, even when you're the one causing the pain. So you walk away thinking everything is fine, thinking you've handled it well, thinking there's nothing left to worry about. But in reality, you've just been given the chance to avoid facing what you've done. And if you take that chance, you don't grow from it. You just move forward, unchanged. Min told me that when he left her apartment that night, he felt lighter. Not happy, but relieved. Like something difficult had been resolved without conflict. "I thought I did the right thing," he said. Or at least, he thought he had handled it in the least painful way possible. That's how we measure things sometimes, isn't it? Not by whether they're right or wrong, but by how much discomfort they cause us in the moment. And if something doesn't hurt immediately, we assume it's okay. But some consequences don't arrive right away. They wait. They give you space. They let you believe everything is settled until the moment they return, and suddenly everything feels different. I asked him if there was any part of him that still felt uneasy when he left. He thought about it, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, but it was quiet, not loud enough to stop him. Not strong enough to change anything, just there, like a small voice in the background. Easy to ignore, easy to move past. And that's exactly what he did. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away from the person who had just made it as easy as possible for him to hurt her without ever making him feel like he had. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because at that moment, he still believed there was nothing to look back at. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous belief of all. After Min left, the apartment became quiet again. Not an unusual kind of quiet, just the same stillness that had always been there. The same walls. The same small kitchen. The same soft ticking of time passing without interruption. But something had changed. Not in the room. In her. She stood there for a moment after closing the door, not moving, not reacting immediately, just letting the silence settle. Because sometimes you don't feel things all at once. Sometimes they arrive slowly, piece by piece. And when they do, they don't overwhelm you. They simply become clear. She didn't need Min to say it directly. She had understood long before he finished his sentence, maybe even before he started speaking. The way he avoided her eyes, the way his words circled around something he couldn't name, the way his voice carried a weight he didn't know how to place. All of it pointed to one thing, not a lack of space, not a complicated guest list, but something much simpler, something much more difficult to accept. She didn't fit, not in the world he was stepping into, not in the image that was being carefully built around him. And strangely, she didn't feel surprised. That's what struck me the most when Min told this part of the story. There was no shock in her reaction, no sense of disbelief, just understanding. Not the kind that excuses everything, but the kind that sees things for what they are, without needing them to be different. He told me she sat down slowly after he left, poured herself a cup of tea. The same routine, the same calm movements, but this time, there was no one across from her, and maybe that's when it became real. Not when he spoke, not when she responded, but when the moment passed and left her alone with what it meant. I asked Min how he knew what she felt after he left. He hesitated, then said something quietly. She never told me directly. Of course she didn't. People like her rarely do. But there are other ways to understand someone. Small details. Things you don't notice at first, but remember later. He said that in the days before the wedding, she stopped talking about it. Not because she wasn't interested, but because she had already placed herself outside of it. That's what hurt the most when he realized it later. Not that she wasn't invited, but that she had accepted her absence so completely that she no longer saw herself as part of that moment at all. She didn't expect anything from me anymore, he said, and there was something in that sentence that felt heavier than disappointment. Because expectation means connection. It means someone still believes they belong in your life. When that expectation disappears, something else disappears with it. Something harder to bring back. But here's the part that changed everything. She didn't become distant. She didn't pull away. If anything, she remained exactly the same. Kind, warm, present. She still asked about his work. Still spoke to him with the same gentle tone. Still treated him as if nothing had changed. And that's what made it almost impossible to see the truth at the time. Because we often assume that if someone isn't reacting, they aren't affected. But that's not always true. Sometimes people choose not to show their pain, not because it isn't there, but because they don't want it to become a burden for someone else, even when that someone else is the reason for it. Min told me there was one detail he didn't understand until much later. She started organizing things. Quietly, carefully, going through papers, sorting through documents. At the time, it didn't seem important. Just something she did. Another small routine. Another ordinary action. But looking back, he realized it wasn't random. It was intentional. Deliberate. As if she was preparing something. Not for herself, but for him. I didn't notice it then, he said. I thought everything was fine. And that's the part that stays with me. Because sometimes, the biggest changes in our lives are happening right in front of us. And we don't see them, not because they're hidden, but because we're not looking for them. He thought the situation had settled, that everything had been handled, that there was nothing left to confront. But while he was moving forward, she was doing something else, something quiet, something final, something that would change the way he saw everything. Just days before the wedding. And by the time he understood what she had been preparing, it would already be too late to undo what he had done. 3 days before the wedding, Min wasn't thinking about his grandmother. That's the truth he admitted without trying to soften it. His mind was somewhere else. Schedules, final confirmations, messages that needed replies. Everything was moving fast, faster than he expected. And when life moves that quickly, it's easy to forget what you've chosen to leave behind. That morning felt like any other, until it didn't. A delivery arrived at his office. Nothing unusual. He signed for it without thinking. Didn't even check the sender at first. Just another envelope among many things he had to deal with that day. He placed it on his desk, finished what he was doing, and only then, almost absent-mindedly, he opened it. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Documents. Keys. A letter. He frowned slightly, trying to make sense of it. And then, he saw the handwriting. That's when everything slowed down. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for him to feel something shift. Something quiet but undeniable. I recognized it immediately, he told me. Of course he did. There are certain things you never forget. No matter how much distance you've created. No matter how much you've tried not to think about them. He sat down. Not because he planned to, but because his body reacted before his mind could catch up. He opened the letter and started reading. The first line was simple. Min, you have always been the most important person in my life. Nothing unusual. Nothing unexpected. But something about it felt different now. Maybe because of everything that had happened. Or maybe because, for the first time, he wasn't reading her words from a place of comfort. But from a place of distance, she wrote about his childhood. Not in detail, just small references, moments, memories. The kind that don't seem significant until you realize how much they shaped you. She mentioned the lessons, the time they spent together, the way he used to laugh when he understood something new. He told me his hands started to tighten around the paper at that point, because those weren't just memories. They were reminders of something he had slowly pushed aside. And then the letter changed, not in tone, still calm, still gentle. But the meaning shifted. She wrote about the future, about responsibility, about how difficult it is to build a life without support. And then she said something that stopped him completely. I wanted to give you something I couldn't give you before. He said he read that line twice. Then again, as if reading it differently would change what came next. But it didn't. She had spent years saving, quietly, carefully, not telling anyone, not asking for help, just preparing. And with that, she had bought him an apartment. Not something small, not something temporary. A real home, in a place he could build his life. The documents were there. The keys were real. Everything, already arranged, already done. He stopped reading, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't continue. I didn't understand, he said. At least, not immediately. Because the image he had been holding of her, simple, modest, limited, didn't match what was now in front of him. And suddenly, everything he thought he knew felt incomplete. He went back to the letter. His eyes moved faster now, searching, trying to find something, anything, that would explain it. But there was no explanation, no justification, no mention of what had happened, no reference to the wedding, not even a hint of disappointment. Just one final line. With love, always. That was it. No accusation, no regret, no attempt to make him feel guilty. And somehow, that made it worse. Because guilt that is given to you can be defended against. But guilt that comes from within, that's different. That stays. That grows. He told me the moment it all connected wasn't loud. It didn't hit him like a shock. It settled, slowly, piece by piece. Everything he had ignored. Everything he had justified. Everything he had chosen not to feel. All of it came back at once. And for the first time, he didn't try to explain it away. I saw it clearly, he said. What I did. Not what he said. Not how he handled it. But what it meant. He had measured her by how well she fit into a moment. While she had spent years preparing something that would shape his entire future. He stood up, abruptly. The chair moved back with a sharp sound. Papers scattered slightly on the desk. He didn't notice. Didn't care. There was only one thing in his mind now. I needed to see her, he said. Not later. Not after work. Not when things calmed down. Now. Because suddenly, time didn't feel like something he had plenty of anymore. And for the first time since that morning at the breakfast table, he understood something with absolute clarity. Some decisions don't stay in the moment you make them. They follow you. They wait. And when they return, they don't ask for your permission to be fixed. They just show you what you've already done.